material that I'm going to share is perhaps the most serious that I've ever shared. So we as Seventh-day Adventists in our name have the seventh day and obviously the second Advent. And we've spent a lot of time over the last 4 years since the mandates came in around vaccination. We've spent a lot of time dealing with the statement in relation to that. But there are statements that perhaps we've overlooked, and those statements actually take away our religious liberty when it comes to the Sabbath. And to a degree as well, around proclaiming the second Advent as we know it from a biblical perspective as Seventh-day Adventists. And so whilst there's no laws at the moment, no mandates at the moment, just like there weren't any mandates prior to 2020, those mandates are going to come in relation to the Sunday law. And what we have in place as a church is going to, or has already removed our religious liberty when those mandates come in. It is actually probably the most concerning thing as a Seventh-day Adventist, because we know that the Sunday law is quite likely not very far off, because there's a lot of things happening in America. We know that we need to look to America for these kind of early parts of the movement around this national Sunday law. Everything is in place. So as soon as it's done, we're done for. I have focused on finding primary resources for things I don't like, reporting on things that other people have said. So I really, if you don't believe me, if you don't trust what I'm saying, on all of the screens, if you pause them, you can actually see the links to those things, or even I can send it to you so you can check it out for yourself. So please don't just take my word for it. Trust the Lord alone and check these things out. So without any further background, let's get into the presentation. All right, so as I said, this issue that I'm primarily going to be focusing on is the Sunday versus Sabbath issue, although the second Advent is also obviously of importance as well. But because we know that the National Sunday Law is not far away, I thought this was essential that we need to clarify some things around what has been done. As I said, the SDA church hierarchy have denied everyone religious liberty. So especially when it comes to the seventh-day Sabbath. It's not been denied now because we haven't got any mandates, just like we didn't have mandates initially with immunization, but we do now. There is no institution now that can hold back the Sunday law from being passed, and that includes our church. Now, Ellen White said this. She said, because they are not willing to receive a message of reproof from the Lord, that's my words. She then goes on to say, many will stand in our pulpits with the torch of false prophecy in their hands, kindled from the hellish torch of Satan. So we are to expect these things. We aren't supposed to actually be ignorant that things are coming upon the world. And she talks about how back in the time of the Middle Ages and the Roman Catholic Church, she talks about how there were Christians that were going around, supposed Christians, going around talking to fellow Christians about Sunday and trying to convince them to keep the Sunday. But initially they weren't having much success. So this particular person that she talks about, he went back and he kind of obviously came up with a satanically inspired plan. And he brought with him a roll purporting to be from God himself, which contained the needed command for Sunday observance with awful threats to terrify the disobedient. And he goes on to say that this document was actually produced by Rome, not obviously by God. And then she says the roll forbade labor from the 9th hour or 3 o'clock on Saturday afternoon till sunrise on Monday, and its authority was declared to be confirmed by many miracles. So the question is, when we come to the Sunday law, people go, well, it'll be really obvious. We will know that the Sunday law is not something that we want to keep. And so, you know, as long as we're worshipping on Sabbath, we know that we don't need to worry. Well, back in that day, they would have still been able to worship in the Sabbath hours, but they would have had to work and then also work in the morning and then rest and worship on the Sunday. So it doesn't necessarily mean that we will not have some time for worship on what we know as Sabbath, but what it actually means is that we won't be keeping the fourth commandment properly, which is you shall labor for 6 days and rest on the seventh day. And so don't just expect it to be a blanket, no Sabbath and only Sunday when we see these laws come in. Now I want to talk to everyone about the defeat at Ai. Now we know, for most of us, we know this story. It was the sin of Achan. He went in and he grabbed some things from Jericho as they were trying to conquer Jericho, and he stole them because they were actually meant to be the Lord's. But it actually says about what happened that it was actually the sin of Israel. It says the children of Israel committed a trespass in the accursed thing. Israel has sinned. They have also transgressed my covenant. And yet the majority of Israel didn't even know about what Achan had done. But God actually said, well, even though there is one man and one family that is caught up in this error, the whole of Israel is actually being held responsible. And Joshua, when he comes to the Lord about it, he says, hast thou at all brought this people over Jordan to deliver us into the hand of the Amorites to destroy us? O Lord, what shall I say when Israel turns their backs before their enemies? And then he says, for the Canaanites and all the inhabitants of the land shall hear of it and shall environ us around or surround us and cut off our name from the earth. And what wilt thou do unto thy great name? He actually started to, in his own mind, conflate or somehow join the idea that the name of Israel was actually caught up with the name of God. And whilst it is true, it is absolutely true that what we do as a representation of God, actually, it does affect him, but he should have been most concerned, not about the name of Israel, but the most concern he should have been about was actually the name of God. But that was, he actually got to see what actually was going on. Now, this is something that I often hear people, and they'll say this when they hear this presentation. I know, because I've heard it many times. If the world should understand we are weak, then the name of the Seventh-day Adventist Church will be brought into disrepute. Even though what you are saying is true, stop talking. And I get that a lot, but where does our victory come from? Is it God's power or is it our power? Should we be most concerned about our name or should we be concerned about the Lord's name? Does God need us or do we need him? Has our name already been brought into disrepute because we have made agreements with the world? And I would think that most people who know what's been going on would say yes. Has God's name been brought into disrepute because of those agreements? Yes, they have. Is it God's reputation or name that matters or our reputation? So we should be willing, I believe, to put our reputations on the line for Christ. If it means we actually have to come to terms with our sin in order for Jesus and God to be uplifted, then we need to be willing to do that. Once again, God says to Joshua, because Israel has sinned, therefore the children of Israel could not stand before their enemies, but turn their backs before their enemies because they were accursed. Neither will I be with you anymore, except you destroy the cursed from among you. If we don't deal with what I'm about to share in a way that is very, very forthright and with great urgency, if we go based on the typology of this story, we will not have the Lord with us and we will be accursed. Now, I have great faith and hope in the fact that we will deal with this because the reality is Ellen White has given us prophecies to say that the Lord's church will go through. But our only victory is only being dependent on Christ, not on the things of this world and not on our reputation. It's the Lord's reputation that matters. So this is what God says to God's people through Joshua. Up, sanctify the people and say, sanctify yourselves against tomorrow. He wanted them to set themselves apart, to be consecrated, separated, made holy. Don't be joined with the world anymore, because that's what Achan was doing. He was joining himself with the world, with all of the stuff from Jericho. In fact, it was interesting because the things that he took was a Babylonian garment. Now we know garments in a typological sense point to righteousness. What kind of righteousness do we want? Do we want the righteousness of Christ or do we want the righteousness of the world or Babylon? I would suspect that if we're a true Christian, we do not want the Babylonian garment. And so we need to deal with it. And he coveted them and he hid them in the midst of his tent. Okay, so then early the next morning, after he's asked them to sanctify themselves, Joshua rises up early to deal with this. This is not something that he puts off. What I'm going to share with you today, do not put off dealing with it. This is the biblical method. We are not to put this off. It is urgent. As I said, this is the most solemn thing that I have ever shared in my life. And I want to stress to you, you need to rise up early. Now is the time. Don't wait until the Sunday law has passed, because the Sunday law is it. That's it. It's final. It's done. It's dusted. We need to deal with this now. But unfortunately, he had to go tribe by tribe, family by family, until Achan and his family were finally identified. The day before, they were meant to sanctify themselves and set themselves apart. This is Achan and his family were meant to do that, just like the rest of the Israelites. But unfortunately, they had never dealt with it. And here they are, systematically going through everything, searching. What is it that's put us in such a place that we would be defeated because the Lord is not with us? Now, all of Achan's family knew about what Achan had brought into the tent. It says it was in the midst of the tent. Now, it's not like their tent was 3 stories high and a massive palatial palace. They would have seen the stuff. They would have known it was there. And you can see by the way that God held them accountable, that they knew it was there. Now, we know it's there. So we are part of this family. They were held accountable if we don't report it. See, the sons could have said something, the wife could have said something, the father-in-law could have said something, whoever was in that tent could have said something and said, you know, to Achan the day before, hey, we should get rid of these things. We should be sanctifying ourselves. We should take these to the Lord and confess our sin and deal with it. But they hung on to the very last. And Achan was the one that ended up confessing, but not because he actually had a sorrow of heart. He actually just, you know, he knew he'd been caught out. But, you know, the whole of the family was held accountable. They were all killed. I want to stress that we may not have been the first ones to make these decisions, but if we know those decisions are there, we are accountable for calling for the sanctification of God's people, of the removal of these things from the midst of us.
That's also true. But also, Achan did not repent at the appropriate time, because before they cast Lot and his name was called out, he had opportunities to repent before that happened. So the error of Achan is his failure to actually, during the time of mercy and grace, when the messages of truth is coming, this was his time to repent. He did not do that. And I think the issue now we might be facing, as we speak about these issues, we get called out, but these are messages of love, calling for repentance. If he waits until probation closes, if certain individuals wait until the mark of the beast is enforced, well, it's too late. There was no repentance after the appeals were made.
That's right. And so it tells us that they took everything. It wasn't even just the people. It was the oxes, the asses, the sheep. And I don't understand that, but somehow God just wraps everything up, and they took them down to the valley of Achor, which means trouble. I find it interesting because Achan and Achor have a very similar meaning, and that means trouble. And he says, why have you troubled Israel? Why have you troubled us? And I'm not suggesting that we start taking people out to stone them. That is the least of what I am saying that we should do. The Lord will deal with these issues. And I think I'm not wanting to finger point, because the reality is I don't know where the level of the betrayal is. I don't know whether people in high places in our church have been fully complicit and fully aware of what they're doing, but I do know if we go back far enough, we know where the buck stops, where it actually ends. It's with Satan, and he's betrayed us. But at what level it comes down the line, because people have been overtly complicit, I don't know. I'm not going to start pointing the fingers at that, but I'm asking, because there are pastors who may be listening here, there may be administrators. I know I've got followers who are not followers because they like listening to me. There's followers that listen to me because they want to pull apart everything that I say and condemn me. I want, if you're listening to this is it. There may be other calls, but this is one of them. And we all need to actually listen to the Lord on this, because this is not coming from me. This is actually coming from the Bible. I'm not just saying this to be an alarmist. We need to actually Be faithful to God. God has asked us to be sanctified. This is the Day of Atonement. We are meant to be set apart from the world. This is not a time for us to join with the world and accept all of its things. We need to actually give our hearts entirely over to the Lord. And now is the time, not when the Sunday law comes. That's too late. Now, Ellen White has this quote: "We need divine wisdom and skill that we may improve every opportunity that the providence of God shall prepare for the presentation of truth. While Satan will make masterly efforts to suppress truth, we must stand firm to our principles, reflecting light to the world. We should be alarmed at the least manifestation of a disposition to hush the voices that proclaim the third angel's message." That angel represents the people of God who give the last warning to the world. Let not the fear of man, the desire for patronage, be allowed to obscure a ray of heaven's light. Should the sentinels of truth now fail to sound the warning, they would be unworthy of their positions as light bearers to the world. But should the standard fall from their hands, the Lord would raise up others who would be faithful and loyal. It will require moral courage to do God's work unflinchingly. Those who do this can give no place to self-love, to selfish considerations, ambition, love of ease, or desire to shun the cross. And this is what she actually says is this message. We are commanded to cry aloud, spare not, lift up thy voice like a trumpet. This is a direct quote from Isaiah 58:1. Cry aloud, spare not, lift up thy voice like a trumpet, and show my people their transgression and the house of Jacob their sins. We often think about the third angel's message as being directed to the world, and that's all it is for. It's not for us. But the third angel's message is also meant for his people in the church. So we need to recognize that that kind of message needs to be heeded. Let's continue on with the quote. It says, "Shall we labor to make the name of God a praise in the earth?" This is what we were saying with Joshua. He was like, whose name is going to be brought through the mud because of this? Shall we obey his voice, or shall we listen to the soothing voice of the evil one and be rocked to a fatal slumber just on the eve of eternal realities? The truth is everything to us, or it is nothing. Let those who want to make a name in the world go with the world, but let those who would serve God obey God and not man. In the great conflict between faith and unbelief, the whole Christian world will be involved, including us. All will take sides. Some may not apparently engage in the conflict on either side. They may not appear to take sides against the truth, but they will not come out boldly for Christ through fear of losing property or suffering reproach. All such are numbered with the enemies of Christ. For Christ says, "He that is not with me is against me, and he that gathereth not with me scattereth abroad." And that's from Matthew 12, verse 30. She makes it very clear we are not to remain silent in this time. I've had people say to me, I know people in the high places of our church who see this as wrong, but they want to focus on the evangelism work. This is the evangelism work. Believe it or not, having a church that is faithful to God in all aspects is going to be the greatest witness in this world, because the glory of the Lord will be seen upon us. We won't be just speaking about the glory of the Lord. People will see the glory of the Lord in us, because it's no longer us, it's only Christ. And the only way we can get to that point is if we separate from the world, mentally, ideologically, and spiritually. If we remain silent after what is about to be shared today, my question to you after reading that, and I'm not going to answer it because I hope the Lord convicts you of what is the truth, are we enemies of Christ? So I'm going to just set the background. There are international Sunday conventions, and they've been in place actually for quite a long time. We know, obviously, in the late 1800s, there was an agitation for the Sunday law, which A.T. Jones and to a lesser extent E.J. Wagner and some others were involved in squashing. In the early 1900s, this organization, or this entity, the International Labour Organization, was formed. It was actually part of the League of Nations. So it was a special part of the League of Nations. But in the 1940s, when the United Nations was formed, it came out of the League of Nations and became the United Nations. This particular body was the only entity that came from the League of Nations and transferred into the United Nations. Every other thing just kind of went by the wayside, and the United Nations formed a whole bunch of other arms as a result. And in 1921, so this is before the United Nations was formed, but under the auspices of the International Labour Organization, there was a convention passed by this group, by this entity, called the Weekly Rest Convention. I'm just going to enlarge the text on there. In Article 2 of this convention, it says, the whole of the staff employed in any industrial undertaking, public or private, or any branch thereof, shall accept or otherwise provided for by the following articles, enjoy in every period of 7 days a period of rest comprising at least 24 consecutive hours. The period of rest shall, wherever possible, be granted simultaneously to the whole of the staff of each undertaking. It shall, wherever possible, be fixed so as to coincide with the days already established by the traditions or customs of the country or district. So this is the book, or it was a document that was put out by the International Labour Organization to the different nations prior to them actually voting this convention through. And at the very start of it, it tells you what they actually mean by this. So I've just highlighted the most relevant bit on the first page there. It says in Article 427 of the Treaty of Peace, blah, blah, blah. And this is what they mean by this international convention. The adoption of a weekly rest of at least 24 hours, which should include Sunday, wherever practicable. So this is not just, them coming up with, let's have Monday, Tuesday, whichever day of the week free. No, they actually intended it. It was their intent was to make it Sunday. Just for good measure, this is in 1957, the same International Labour Organization passed another convention called the same thing and pretty much the same wording. So they talk about uninterrupted weekly rest for a period of 24 hours, they're granted simultaneously again, and then the day of week, the rest day should be on the day that's established by tradition or customs. And then if this is the one added little bit in there that wasn't in the one from 1921, if there's religious minorities, then we should, as far as possible, respect their religious practices. So that's as far as possible, though. There might be some possibilities that we can't respect things like, people's religious liberty around certain things, because it might be just best to keep it on a Sunday. So now it is reflected in the Sustainable Development Goals of the United Nations. So it's not just in the International Labour Organization, which is part of the UN. It's reflected right throughout the United Nations. So Sustainable Development Goal 8 is about decent work and economic growth, and 8.5 of that particular goal talks about decent work for all. And that sounds really vague and really nebulous, and like you kind of go, what do they mean by decent work for all? Does it just mean that they're not being treated like slaves? What does that mean?
Yeah.
Well, they tell you what it means. Notice the similarity in terms. So this is a document from 2018 by, once again, the International Labour Organization, and this was their conference that they had in 2018, and this is the document that came from that, calling ensuring decent working time for the future. So this is 2018. And they once again refer to those two conventions that I just showed you, the one from 1921, which is convention number 14, and the one from the 1950s, which is called convention number 106. So they actually are referencing this when they're talking about what they go on to say. So it refers to the collective character of a weekly rest with a view to ensuring wherever possible that it is taken at the same time by all workers on the day established by tradition or custom. The social purpose of this principle is to enable workers to take part in community life and in special forms of recreation. I wonder what those special forms of recreation would be. Would it be church going? I don't know, maybe. It says the principle of Sunday rest is not universal as it has been established by Christian tradition. And then 204, weekly rest is a social necessity and if taken simultaneously enables workers to enjoy their leisure hours together. So it does recognize that there are other places that don't currently keep Sunday, but notice how they're actually steering towards that whole idea that it's Sunday rest. They don't say Monday rest or Friday rest or Saturday rest. They actually specifically reference Sunday rest. And actually, if you do a search throughout this entire document, they mention Sunday 77 times. This is not a coincidence. This is intentional because right back when the very first convention was actually put in place, number 14, they actually were intending it to be about enforcing a Sunday rest from an international perspective, not just nationally. I mean, this is from 2021. There's been more countries that have started to shift their weekends. So UAE, which is a Muslim it's kind of not just really a country, it's kind of like a combination of countries. They've actually shifted their weekend from Friday, Saturday to Saturday, Sunday to be in line with international commerce. So this now becomes their new custom. So they can then also pass a Sunday law. So things are in place for them to do this. And of course, if you have a national, international emergency around climate, there is so many things out there now that are pointing to the fact that the best thing we can do for humanity and the world is to have a day of rest on Sunday. It's the only thing that will save this planet. The United Nations Charter is really, really important because this kind of sets the direction of pretty much everything that's within the United Nations. It has the underpinning principles. And it's all about saving the planet, saving the people, saving everyone from imminent demise because of particularly nuclear bombs. That was how it really started off, because it started the same year that the two nuclear bombs were dropped on Japan in 1945, and everyone, it was the very first thing that they had to deal with as a international body was how do we put conventions in place to prevent nuclear annihilation. So it was all about saving the planet, and they talk about having unity, common interest, and working together for all peoples. So remember that we just read in those conventions that it was unified rest, where people were actually able to really experience the true rest that they need when everyone is simultaneously working together and then resting together. That's how we save the planet, according to them. Once again, it talks about combining our efforts. It talks about collective measures and cooperation without distinction, common ends. So all of those things that I've just highlighted, harmonizing with my underlining. All of this language is around, we all need to just be in sync with one another, because that's the only way that we can save ourselves. You know, Christ doesn't save us, we save us, and we do it from this perspective. That's what the UN says. And then you have the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, which is the key document that every nation in the world bases their human rights statements on. So it talks about the spirit of brotherhood, being unified together. And then the second last article says everyone has duties to the community in which alone the free and full development of his personality is possible. So only when we are actually working in unison together, even with Sunday rest, can we really truly develop our personality and be free and that sort of thing. This is the mentality behind all of these statements. And so when you see it reoccurring in other, someone's just written common good. Yes, that's exactly what it's all about. It's just different language, but the same principle behind it. Solidarity, fraternity, all of these words all essentially are talking about the same thing. It's our only means of saving ourselves and saving the planet. And so that's why we need to have synchronized rest. So a summary of these rest conventions. It's about decent work conditions, which requires weekly rest time. It should be communal or simultaneous. Only way that we are truly free and everyone is truly free, we're practicable, it should be on a Sunday, and it's in harmony with the UN Charter, the brotherhood that brings peace. And so this is really the basis of an international Sunday law, and it's been in place since 1921. none of us realized. Well, I certainly didn't realize. Maybe some other people who are listening realized all along, but it's new to me, and I'm sure it's new to some others. So in 2024, so just last year, I'm sure many of you have heard about this, the Pact for the Future, and I did speak about this previously in a previous talk, but I just want to re-emphasize it because this was all of the heads of the state around the world who came together at the United Nations to kind of reaffirm the principles behind the UN Charter. So protect the needs and interests of present and future generations through the actions of this pact for the future. And they talk about how through all the different innovations, they can accelerate the realization of the aspirations of the United Nations, because of course, got to make sure the aspirations of the United Nations are fulfilled. And it says, once again, we only realize that potential or this potential through international cooperation. When we all work together, we will strengthen United Nations systems, they agreed to, and we'll strengthen our partnerships, including with faith-based organizations. So it's all about trying to bring the whole world together so we can save ourselves. And so that was what they were all agreeing to. And once again, they emphasized this point around Sustainable Development Goal 8, promote decent work. So they were once again making an indirect reference back to Convention number 14 and Convention, I think it's 106 or 107 from the 1950s around having that weekly rest. They were all agreeing to accelerate this in 2024. So if we see things rapidly going towards the Sunday law, this is why they've agreed to accelerate it. So every head of state signed up to it in 2024. It was about strengthening the position of the UN and accelerating its aspirations. It's about creating stronger partnerships, including with churches or faith-based organizations. And it was once again reiterating that simultaneous weekly rest. From 2024, the United Nations and all of the nations that agree to that have actually agreed to try and implement a Sunday law. It's not directly spoken, but if you trace it back to what the original convention was all about, which all of the conventions and all of the things have been since, it's about trying to achieve a Sunday rest. So if the international instruments were there in 1921, I can hear people asking us, what has the world been waiting for? Why haven't they implemented the Sunday law already? If that was there, what stopped them? What happened to the Blair Bill in the late 1800s? It disappeared. So why can't this one disappear? This is what I believe they've been waiting for. Members of the Seventh-day Adventist Church were the most significant instrumental force in preventing the Blair Bill from being passed, but we are no longer the most instrumental force in picking up on these things and actually pushing back against them. We have become silent. We have not actually sounded the warning because we've become ignorant, because we've joined with these people, with these nations who are intent on destroying God's name and on destroying God's people and destroying his theology. We have, in today's world, we have this false idea of love that if we actually call something truth and that person over here doesn't espouse that truth, then we're being hateful. But if I'm telling someone they're about to step off a cliff and they probably should pull back, is it hateful to warn them that that's actually the cliff? Do we actually believe that this world is coming to an end and the Lord is bringing a judgment upon people who don't want to accept his truth? Because if we don't believe it, then by all means, go ahead and just snooze on. But if we actually believe that the world is coming to an end and only those who love Christ's truth will actually go through and be with him in heaven, then do not snooze on. We cannot do this. This is not being loving to actually not warn people. You know, we've been ignorant and we need to stop this. We need to stop it. If one part of the body is hurting, whether it be in Africa, in Australia, in the US, we need to actually recognize that that hurt is because there's something erroneous amongst us and the Lord is not fully with us. And, you know, some people didn't experience the persecution of job loss and all of that sort of thing with the whole, you know, mandates over the last few years. And they sort of just go, oh, what's this? You know, stop talking about these kind of things. It's nonsense. Well, if you've experienced it, you'll know that it wasn't nonsense. And what is coming upon us is even greater than what we've experienced over the last few years. And we need to recognize that if it's if there is a warning now, then the warning is not to be taken in vain. We need to respond to it. And the Lord has been so gracious to share these warnings in scripture, in Ellen White's writings. And now we have evidence in secular writings that are becoming obvious to us now because of the internet that we didn't know about before. And so we need to listen, stop turning our ears and eyes away because it's uncomfortable. The SDA hierarchy have laid the foundation. Now, I want to be clear on this. I am not saying that the different people that have been in these positions are absolutely 100% fully aware of what they've gotten themselves into. They may have been, they may not have been, and we cannot judge their motives. All we can do is look at what has happened. Now, I spoke about this previously, the 11th Annual Symposium on the Role of Religion and Faith-Based Organizations in International Affairs. This was a symposium that was held this year. I spoke about it on the Cosmic Agenda #2. I've actually revamped the thumbnails for that, so if people are looking for the videos of that on my YouTube channel, the second picture is what you need to look for. But in that symposium, it was about them talking about the pact for the future that had been made in 2024. And they were talking about how we can actually all work together. This is another website still talking about this symposium. And it says, it mentions a Seventh-day Adventist person. It says the Director of Public Affairs and Religious Liberty for the Seventh-day Adventist Church and one of the symposium's founding members. The Seventh-day Adventist Church was the founding member, or one of the founding members. There was 3 of them. And this is another article talking about it. So it was looking at the vital role of faith-based organizations addressing urgent challenges such as climate change, human rights violation, and peace building. And once again, it says that there would be a representative at that symposium from the General Conference of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. So we have, as a church, had people from the hierarchy representing us at this symposium to try and implement the Pact for the Future. Now, the Pact for the Future was also about that weekly rest, ensuring equal opportunities around having synchronized rest time each week. Now, we've spoken a lot about the official statements that are on our website. And once again, I want to reiterate, it's under the heading, What We Believe. This is not just a side heading. This is a crucial heading. Hank Viljoen, who I've worked with SDA Pearl, actually wrote a sort of a really good synopsis of what happened on Fulcrum 7 at the GC 2025. I'm sure a lot of people are aware, but he actually nicely sort of summarizes things. And what really was the focus of a lot of the movement at that time was, yes, the UN was mentioned, but in terms of the statements, the immunization statement was really the focus. Once again, it's the Lord's mercy that we actually had COVID-19 and all of the things that happened, because we wouldn't have actually realized that statements could be used against us. This actually gave us it alerted us to just how powerful and meaningful these statements are in the scheme of things. This I've shared before as well, but I want to reiterate it. This was a letter that a friend of mine actually received from their employer when they were denying them a religious exemption request. And they actually say, based on the information provided on the Seventh-day Adventist Church website. So if you think these statements are not being looked at as well, and he actually goes on in the second page of that letter to quote directly from what was the statement at the time. We all know that there's been some minor changes, but substantively it's the same. And then at the end of the letter, he says, whilst we can continue going backwards and forwards with arguments, your main objection is based on religious beliefs. Upon reviewing the documentation, and remember he got that from the website, that has been made available by the Seventh-day Adventist Church, it is clear that the church provides a pathway for you to receive the therapy. If you think these statements do not matter, think again. Think again, because we know they matter to employers and to governments. This is the Church State Council organization, which is an Adventist organization. I'll show you a little bit more about it in just a second. But they put this memo out at the time, so I'm just going to look back at the date. So it was February 1, 2021. It says, please do inform church members that the teaching and policy of the Seventh-day Adventist Church is pro the therapy. Do encourage people to receive it. And then it went on to say, in many cases, the objection is not religious at all, but is based on health. The belief that the vaccine has a significant risk of harm. My health is related to my spirituality, so it is religious. If I am seriously harmed, as I know people who have been seriously harmed, and I know I often mention his name, Daniel Rosina is one of those, it stops you from having an ability to perform the work the Lord has given you to do. And then they say employers have the right to mandate because the government says so. And the Church State Council does not expect our litigation committee will approve filing any case on behalf of those who refuse the therapy and lose their jobs. So this was a memo that they put out in 2021. They were filled with intent around not providing any kind of support around religious liberty. Now, mandates didn't come in February 2021. They came in later. Now, this is this just a little bit of, I didn't know what the Church State Council was. I thought it was like another entity, but it's actually Seventh-day Adventists. As Seventh-day Adventists, we stand in the Protestant and Enlightenment traditions. Now, that to me is like an oxymoron. So this may be why they put out a memo saying what they did. The Enlightenment tradition is what gave birth to the French Revolution. It's where they get the liberty, the original Declaration of Human Rights in the French Revolution, but it was actually false. It wasn't God's view of liberty. So I'm not sure why they say Protestant and Enlightenment, because Protestant separates church and state. You don't need to talk about enlightenment. Now, I just did some little statistics charts on the statements, just so you get a bit of an idea of how problematic these statements are. There are 59 statements altogether. 36% are based on the United Nations ideology, with 19% of those, of the total of the 59%, are explicitly mentioning the United Nations. Some of them don't even mention the Bible or Ellen White, but they'll mention the United Nations. 43% are engaged with promulgating political ideology. So that's including the United Nations stuff, as well as other ideologies around influencing the state. I'm not going to read through this long list, but there are 11. Just that 19% works out to be 11. And that's, if you want to have a look at these documents to check for yourself, each of these actually expressly mentions the United Nations or its associated bodies such as the World Health Organization. These ones here use the terminology and ideology of the United Nations, things like brotherhood, things like bridge builders, things like goodwill, solidarity, those kind of words that the United Nations uses about working together with all of our brethren. And when they mean brethren, they do not mean Seventh-day Adventists. They mean the entire human race. In fact, the very last statement, one humanity, is all about how there is no difference between all of us. We're all of one family. That is not true. From the very beginning of Earth's history, there were two families. There was the family of God and the family of Cain. And God has always kept them separate. Abraham was pulled out of Ur. Moses and the Israelites were pulled out of Egypt. They were always to come out and be separate. And then there's these five that call upon governments to implement policies and legislation, which might seem like an okay thing to do when you look at these topics, but we are not to get engaged in political affairs. That's just not something that as Seventh-day Adventists we should be doing. Defending against laws, absolutely, but not requesting laws to be made. And there's more problems than just the United Nations and political entities. So I had a look at all of the statements. It's very long and boring in some ways. And you really do have to pray as you're reading through it, because they're so cleverly worded that on one hand you think, oh, there's nothing wrong. And then on the other hand, you go, hang on, but why did they say that? That doesn't make sense. That's not theologically sound. So from what I can see, there is 51% that are overtly theologically problematic. And then 49%, they may be theologically okay, but maybe if you look at them, you might disagree with me and you might actually add more to them that are actually really problematic. So there's one that basically says that the Roman Catholic Church has had positive changes recently. There's another one that essentially advocates a magisterium approach to theological differences in our church. Then there's two that limits evangelism and proselytism And then there's 2 that limit our liberty in regards to bodily autonomy. I said earlier when I started that the church has actually undermined our view around the second advent. These particular statements here actually indicate that whoever wrote them thought that maybe we're going to establish a kingdom on this earth, a kingdom of peace, somewhat like the evangelicals believe, and they believe in universalism, which is, i.e., everyone gets saved. So these statements actually attack the judgment, the second advent, and historical eschatology that we've actually held on to as a church. And I'm just going to give you 2 examples because this is not my focus. I really want to focus on the Sabbath Sunday issue, but this is how problematic. It is not just the immunization statement. It's not just the statements that are going to be about the Sabbath Sunday issue. It is a huge portion of these statements. So this one, global poverty. Seventh-day Adventists join the global community in supporting the United Nations Millennium Development Goals. These are the precursors to the Sustainable Development Goals. Now, just that alone is about the Millennium Development Goals were about ushering in the new millennium of peace. They had a Millennium Summit in the year 2000, and the Attorney General at the time actually said, I hope that this summit actually sees the new millennium of peace. Now, that is the language around the new millennium, the 1,000 years of peace. But they became sustainable development goals in 2015. So maybe the mentality around whether or not we'd actually entered into the millennium had changed, i.e. we had entered in. And it talks about Adventists partner with civil society, governments, and others to establish enduring justice in a broken world. We will never have full justice in this world, because this world is not our home. This world is not under the authority of Jesus Christ entirely. So there is no way we can ever establish enduring justice in a broken world unless we think we're actually ushering in the millennium of peace. As followers of Christ, we engage in this task, and this is actually the next paragraph, so they're talking about the enduring justice bit, with determined hope, energized by God's visionary promise of a new heaven and a new earth where there is no poverty or injustice. Now, they've just said they're working towards the task of establishing enduring justice in a broken world. And they're saying that to do that, they're going to bring in the new heaven and the new earth. This is really bad theology. Seventh-day Adventists are called to live imaginatively and faithfully inside the vision of God's kingdom by acting to end poverty now. Jesus says, the poor you will have with you always. We can never establish a millennium of peace in this world where there is enduring justice and no poverty. That is not our remit. We are not asked to do that. And this one's peace. It is therefore right and proper for Christians to promote peace. I agree. But what kind of peace? The Seventh-day Adventist Church urges every nation to beat its swords into plowshares and its spears into pruning hooks. That's a quote from Isaiah 2:4. But Isaiah 2:5 says that it's only when they walk in the light of the Lord. So if you see nations that have not given their entire heart over, which no nation is going to these days, over to the Lord, there is no way we should be calling upon them to do that. In fact, if you go to Joel, this is what we're to proclaim among the Gentiles. Prepare war, wake up the mighty men, let all the men of war draw near, let them come up, beat your plowshares into swords and your pruning hooks into spears. Let the weak say, I am strong. Let the heathen be wakened and come up to the valley of Jehoshaphat, which is like the valley of Armageddon, for there will I sit to judge all the heathen round about. So they're actually saying that we should be giving a message that is coupled with the establishment of God's kingdom on this earth. That is not the message we are supposed to be giving. And then, of course, it's not just reflected in these statements. If you actually scroll over, this is the homepage, adventist.org. We looked at what we believe in the statements. But if we go to what we do, the language there is similar kind of language. We believe that no one will be hungry in the new earth. So we have humanitarian agencies like ADRA that are trying to feed the hungry to anticipate this future reality. Are we going to have humanitarian agencies in the new earth? We also believe that no one will be sick or even ignorant in this new earth, which is why we have hospitals and schools everywhere. Each act of service is a preview of God's coming kingdom, a tangible expression of his love in a world that desperately needs hope. This is subtle language. but it is the language of a new millennium of peace. I mean, we've got the Maslow's hierarchy, this whole idea that, you know, we reach a state of, I'm trying to remember the word that he uses, but basically a state of enlightenment and actuation or something like that, because we've had our physical needs met, and then we've had our security needs met, and then our social, there's this whole idea. But the reality is that Jesus was able to actually have all of his needs met through the wilderness, and his greatest need was was to have a spiritual experience with God, and he came through the other end. He hadn't eaten for 40 days. Moses did the same. Elijah, has done that as well. And you look throughout the Bible, and it's not physical food that we most need, it's the spiritual food that we most need. And the thing that we've often done as Christians, and it's not just Seventh-day Adventists, is we outsource that kind of care. We should be caring for our neighbors. We should care for those who we walk past in the street that are suffering. Maybe we should invite them into our home. Or do we keep it all very clinical and send our money off to somewhere for someone else to do it in a very, corporate way? That's not actually bringing the gospel to people. That's just bringing food. And God actually, when Jesus came to this earth, he didn't send emissaries on his behalf. He came. And then he gave them bread, both spiritual and physical. In fact, if you look at the feeding of the 5,000, what did he give them first? It was not the physical, it was the spiritual. And so we need to remember that where our priorities lay. But the problem is, the reason why people are doing this, they're prioritizing the physical here and now, is because they think this is all we have. And they don't realize the urgency of the time. If they actually could see spiritually Jesus standing just beyond the veil, and the winds of strife being held with strained ropes by the angels, they would be warning the people that they're giving the bread to first about the spiritual, crisis that's coming upon them, and then give them the bread as they open the word of God to them. But unfortunately, people think that this is where we're at, and we're going to be here for many, many more years. And so whilst the Lord delays his coming, we slumber and sleep. This is from ADRA, the 2018 annual report. Now, they love the Sustainable Development Goals. And you can see that they're very much pro implementing the UN's initiatives. In fact, the UN loves them so much that in that year, they gave them $43,931,638 to ensure that they implemented the Sustainable Development Goals. Once again, we are not going to have sustainable development. We're going to have a crisis. The whole world is going to burn up. We should not be, working towards sustainable development. This is what they say: the SDGs are ambitious, but ADRA is committed to designing and implementing projects that support them in the ultimate goal of accomplishing all SDGs by 2030. ADRA is wanting to see Agenda 2030 implemented with gusto. And of course, one of them is this no poverty thing. That's goal number 1, end poverty in all its forms everywhere. In 2024, in October 2024, this article appeared on the ADRA website. ADRA celebrates United Nations Day by emphasizing its global mission. And this is the actual leader of the director of ADRA International United Nations Liaison Office. And he says that reflecting on the UN's theme for that year, which was the world needs the UN and the UN needs us, and how it aligns with ADRA's mission. This is what he says: this theme resonates deeply with us at ADRA. It embodies our collective responsibility in a world that seeks peace, security, and integration. Notice these words of coming together, being collective. We understand that our work at the community level is crucial. Through our projects and active participation in UN working groups, we contribute to global peace initiatives, economic development, and social cohesion. And then he says the UN, representing member states from around the globe, is an invaluable partner in this mission. Together, we can advocate for global peace and forge connections that transcend borders. There is only one Prince of Peace, and that is Christ himself. The UN is not submitted to Christ, not submitted to the truths of the Bible. So it is not an invaluable partner. It's a partner of Satan. Like that's where we need to realize, Psalms chapter 2 says the kings of the earth sit together and they take counsel against the Lord and against his anointed. Do we believe the Bible? Because that's what it says. We need to actually believe what the Lord has said to us and stop fiddling around with these kind of unions and thinking that it's actually fulfilling some kind of mission. The people will go, oh, that's ADRA. That's not the church. Why are you talking about ADRA? Because, we're most concerned about the church and all the rest of it. Well, this is what the former president said at the spring meeting in 2025. So earlier this year, he says, ADRA is doing a wonderful work in the name of Jesus. Now, on that point, if you look at what I've just read previously, you decide for yourself, is that a true statement? But then he goes on to say, but the organization ADRA represents the Adventist church in so many ways and is very closely connected to the church. So if the head of our church says that ADRA basically represents our church, then he knows, he does know, and it is true, it says Adventist Development Relief Agency. So when people look at it, they know that it's connected. Now, these are the 4 statements that all deny our religious liberty in relation to the seventh-day Sabbath. Interestingly, they're all linked to the UN, and in particular, UN religious liberty documents. But unfortunately, they actually deny religious liberty. How clever is that? They say religious liberty, but by the same token, they deny it. Why is it that we have swallowed this? Because the powers of the world went out fishing and our church leadership swallowed the bait. They got told that there'd be peace, there'd be prosperity, and there'd be security if only they joined up. And consequently, I just feel Isaiah 52:3, the beginning of it says, for thus says the Lord, you've sold your souls for naught. We get nothing from it. Not really. I mean, ADRA gets money for it. What do we get from it? What do the individuals of the church get from it? We get nothing from this association except for heartache and mandates that remove our liberty. Why do we do this? So this is a video. It's really blurry. I did try and see if I could put it into something that could enhance it so you could kind of see the people better, but it didn't do anything. And it's slightly clipped off at the very start. And so I'm assuming, based on what gets said from here, that the beginning part that's clipped off, it actually is the Seventh-day Adventist Church shares. So keep that in mind as you listen to it.
Shares a great deal in the outreach and the ministry of the United Nations and their particular emphasis. And tonight, it is my very great pleasure, a personal pleasure, to welcome our distinguished guest and his dear wife, Mimi. Ladies and gentlemen, when we considered this great meeting, our president, Dr. Paulson, made a special appeal to His Excellency Kofi Annan, the Secretary General of the United Nations, suggesting that perhaps he would like to come to this assembly, greet the people, and encourage them in the work which they are doing worldwide. He seriously considered it, but realizing that we're living in very tenuous times, and when there are some extreme tensions in our world today, not being sure whether he could be here, even if he promised to be here, he deferred and indicated that he would like to send a message, and then he selected one of his trusted associates. I am honored and proud tonight because it's my privilege to introduce to you a very dear, special friend, His Excellency, the Undersecretary General for the United Nations, Joseph Reed. Please, my brothers and sisters, welcome him in the proper way.
President Paulson, Elder Falkenberg, Elder Wilson, Secretary Bediako, Treasurer Rawson, Governor General Sir Silas Atopare of Papua New Guinea, Excellencies, religious observers, delegates, distinguished friends. Congratulations to the elected leaders. Good wishes, Godspeed. Delegates, on behalf of the Secretary General of the United Nations, Mr. Kofi Annan, I welcome this opportunity to greet all of you assembled here in the great city of Toronto for the General Conference session of the Seventh-day Adventists. I salute all in the planning and organizing committees who brought this milestone gathering, the quinquennial World Session, together. A great accomplishment, a great feat. President Paulson, I feel proud and privileged to be here with you. In our changing and interdependent world, the Seventh-day Adventists provide a beacon of conscious humanism and spiritual leadership. Delegates, our special thanks to your presidents, Dr. Paulson, Dr. Falkenberg, and Elder Wilson, and all your leadership for all you have done over the years to keep that beacon shining bright. Delegates, allow me to use this occasion in a personal capacity as Undersecretary General of the United Nations to appeal to you, representatives of the Seventh-day Adventists from around the world, to continue to give the United Nations the support we need for our world organization. I make this appeal because the United Nations is also your organization, our world organization, your United Nations. Without the global efforts of the United Nations, all of our efforts for peace, development, equality, and justice would be to no avail. Delegates, please remember, the United Nations is the only machinery we have for collective cooperation among all nations. It is the only worldwide institution for furthering development. The United Nations is the only universal mechanism for protecting human rights.
The thing that really horrifies me is that no one actually stood up and said, this is horrifying. What are you saying? It's the only place on earth that we can actually find our actual human rights met. You know, this is not biblical. What were they doing? What were they thinking? Why were they silent? It's time for us to no longer be silent. This is not the time. Now, these things have actually been foretold. I've just released a series that I did. It took about 6 hours altogether of time where I was sitting with Brother Ron Duffield for one day, and poor guy, he was going into the night. It was going into my day. It didn't really affect me so much, but he presented this amazing series. If you want to actually understand historically what was actually said about the unity with the world and then with the UN from a historical perspective, you've got to actually go through this. Jeremiah says this about God's people at his time. Now remember, at the time that Jeremiah was on this earth and he was, ministering to his people, it was also the time that Babylon was rising to its power. And we know, and it was actually taking the nations captive. We know, antitypically, we've reached that day as well. Revelation 17, the woman has Babylon on her forehead. So we're at the very end of time. So what we see in Jeremiah relates to us today. And he says, many pastors have destroyed my vineyard. They have trodden my portion underfoot. They have made my pleasant portion a desolate wilderness. They have made it desolate, and being desolate, it mourneth unto me. The whole land is made desolate, because no man layeth it to heart. That really cuts to my heart when he says, no man layeth it to heart. Now, that doesn't mean that actually no one did, because Jeremiah obviously had it laid to his heart, but insufficient did. Are we insufficiently aroused to actually see that this is a problem, that our God's beloved church is being destroyed from the inside out, that we will remain silent? Like, I don't know, as I said, I don't know what happened in the year 2000, that so many of the delegates sat there, so many of the leaders sat there, didn't discern what was being said sufficiently alarming to actually stand up and say something. Maybe there was, maybe I'm just not aware of it. Let's have a look at these statements. I showed the 4 statements. This is the first one. It's called Tolerance. It was released in 1995. It begins with this: Seventh-day Adventists, not just the Seventh-day Adventists General Conference, it's the Seventh-day Adventists. So that means you and I and every Seventh-day Adventist support the United Nations proclamation of 1995 as the year of tolerance. What does that mean? Well, if you go to the United Nations and look up what they meant by the year of tolerance, they released a declaration called the Declaration of Principles on Tolerance. It was released in November 1995. This was in relation to the year of tolerance. And they list in their preamble, well, they first of all, they say, recalling the preamble to the Constitution of UNESCO, adopted on the 16th of November 1946, states that peace, if it is not to fail, must be founded on the intellectual and moral solidarity of mankind. So once again, if we can all come together morally and intellectually, then we'll have peace. So that was the underlying principle of tolerance. But then it lists a whole bunch of UN instruments that are really, really crucial to understanding tolerance. So I looked through that long list and I went, I don't have time to read them all. Which one, Lord, is going to be the most problematic? And the one that I've highlighted was the only one I looked at. It stood out to me in terms of its name. And so I went to that. It's called the Declaration on the Elimination of All Forms of Intolerance, and of Discrimination Based on Religion or Belief. Considering that it is essential to promote understanding, tolerance, and respect in matters relating to freedom of religion or belief, and to ensure that the use of religion or belief for ends inconsistent with the Charter, other relevant instruments of the United Nations, and the purposes and principles of the present declaration is inadmissible. Really long sentence. They love long sentences. Essentially, it's saying you can't do anything outside of what we're going to say in this document because it's not admissible. Anything to do with the Charter, that if you want to go against it, it's not admissible. That's what it means to be tolerant. You can't do anything that you're not allowed to do, according to the UN. And then Article 1, it says in point 3, freedom to manifest one's religion or belief may be subject only to such limitations as are prescribed by law and are necessary to protect public safety, order, health, or morals, or the fundamental rights and freedoms of others. Now remember, we have a law that says, or a convention that says, and that's been instituted into the laws of the land, that we all need 24 hours of rest each week. And that the only way to have full development of the human intellect and personality, we need to have communal experiences, including communal rest. And in order to ensure safety, we need to have everyone being nice and healthy, and the only way that can be is mentally healthy as well. So this is why you actually saw churches could be shut down over COVID, because tolerance actually meant that you could shut down churches, because it was actually looking after everyone according to what the law saw was appropriate. It also means that they could mandate things in relation to our body temple, because they were saying we needed, despite what your religious convictions are, you need to take this therapy, otherwise you will kill someone else. And so that was looking after the public safety, order, and health of the collective community. That's what it means to be tolerant. And it also will be the basis for the Sunday laws. In order for us to demonstrate tolerance to our fellow man and actually care for their health, mental health as well as physical health, we need to make sure that we have a universal day of rest. And obviously, if we're looking after the climate, we're also looking after our fellow man as well. And if we keep the Sunday law, it's actually going to look after our climate. When we had this statement on our website in 1995, we were saying it is okay for nations to make laws in relation to our worship. This is the second statement that is there. It's called religious freedom. Well, that sounds wonderful too. But this is what it says. For more than centuries, Seventh-day Adventists have been active promoters of religious freedom. True. We recognize the need to champion freedom of conscience and religion as a fundamental right in harmony with the scriptures. Is that what it says? It says in harmony with the instruments of the United Nations. How do we understand human rights? Remember what that guy was saying from the United Nations at the General Conference in the year 2000? He was actually saying that the United Nations is the only place where you can have your human rights met.
I thought the Constitution of the United States says that we have inalienable right, which is given to us by God, because we are made in God's image. So, okay, so now if you give that over to the UN, well, they can give it and take it away whenever they want to.
That's right. Now, but I have a friend that I met, if anyone's heard of him, is called William Pitt, and I'm hoping to do an interview with him. And he did a research dissertation on how we've got laws in Australia which were about ensuring religious liberty when it came to particularly the day of worship. But what has happened, the laws haven't been changed. The Constitution hasn't been changed, but the interpretation of the Constitution has changed over time. And it's changed to actually mean that yes, states and so forth can make laws against our religious liberty and our worship. And so the same thing will happen when it comes to the American Constitution. It doesn't mean that it will be rewritten necessarily. It actually means it will be reinterpreted to fit what the UN or what the global body has actually put in place. Now, some people will say America has, particularly Donald Trump, has pushed back against the UN, and so therefore, why are you even talking about the UN? We've got to remember that the UN is actually more the mouthpiece of America than America being the mouthpiece of the UN. America actually started the UN. It was actually Protestant America that actually were the most foremost in agitating for the UN. America is the greatest funder of the UN. So what you see the UN doing has actually, it can really only do what the America allows it to do in a degree. There are some nuances to that, but you know, in terms of the influence that the UN has on America, it's kind of a funny situation because it's like it's ruling by proxy. It actually, you know, washes its hands of being the policeman, but it actually is the policeman, as in America is pretending like it's not the policeman, but it actually is the policeman. They try and pretend to remove themselves from the UN, but they actually aren't. America still is the largest funder for the UN, even under Donald Trump. So yes, see this as being a warning to not just people everywhere else. It is also a warning to those in the US. So this is the second statement. Continuing on, it says, as loyal citizens, of course, we're loyal citizens of this earth. I'm not. I'm a loyal citizen of the heavenly kingdom first. But anyway, as loyal citizens, Adventists believe they have the right to freedom of religion, subject to. Are we supposed to have any of our religious rights subject to anything? If it's biblical, it should be subject to no man, but subject to the equal rights of others. And that includes collective worship. So if you are being a stick in the mud and not allowing the world to go through their collective worship, and you keep saying that's the wrong day of the week, then you're going to be persecuted. And our church is going to say, well, as Adventists, you believe that your religious freedom should be subject to the equal rights of others. This is the third statement. Once again, I've spoken about this before, the 50th anniversary of the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. This is a statement that they released in 1998 on the 50th anniversary. And I've said about this before that I just can't get past this wording. It says on here that the Universal Declaration of Human Rights comes from the best and highest part of the human heart. Like, to me, that's just insane to say this. But we've got to remember, these are listed under beliefs. It's not a little side tab somewhere else. It's listed under beliefs. Remember, I showed you that letter that showed where people were actually, employers were looking at the website for the documents. It says, coming from the best and highest part of the human heart, the Universal Declaration is a fundamental document standing for human dignity, liberty, equality, and non-discrimination of minorities. Article 18, which upholds unconditionally religious liberty in belief and practice. And then it goes on, politicians, trade union leaders, teachers, employers, media representatives, and all opinion leaders should give strong support to human rights. In this way, the Universal Declaration will grow in practical importance and luster and never risk becoming an irrelevant document. So if you call this into question, you as an Adventist are not adhering to supposedly the beliefs of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. So let's just look at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Earlier, I just referenced point 1 under Article 29, where we have to have the community. But point number 3 in Article 29 is the clincher. It just basically entirely wipes all of our religious liberty, any human rights at all, because it says that you have these rights and freedoms may in no case be exercised contrary to the purposes and principles of the United Nations. So if the United Nations, not that I think they ever will, but suddenly comes up with a thing saying everyone must stand on their head because that's going to achieve sustainable development, then, well, unfortunately, you'll need to stand on your head. Now, that's a ridiculous example, but it just, that this is the purposes and principles of the United Nations don't necessarily come from the heart, the highest and greatest part of the human heart. They actually come from a Luciferian heart, because Lucis Trust and all of the other entities out there are involved in this. Every kind of religious organization that you can possibly ever think of, all the trade unions, everyone is involved in the United Nations. These are not godly people. They are not calling for purposes and principles that are in harmony with the law of God, with the Bible. And so when we start having documents on our website under beliefs saying that we stand for these things, we are actually undermining our religious liberty. We have none left, none at all. Our church hierarchy have sold us out. The urgency of this, I cannot emphasize it. That's why I said it is the most solemn thing that I've ever had to share. This is not about immunization. It's not about a jab. We could be jabbed 1,000 times over, but we could still keep the Sabbath. But this, if a Sunday law is passed tomorrow, you will have no religious liberty, according to our website. Economic and Social Council, this is where our church is affiliated with the UN and the Seventh-day Adventist Church said this, and I just need to look back at the date. It was 2002. They said this, and it was like a commission on human rights that they were all part of, and this was actually their statement that they made at that. It said, "Yet if the world is not to sink into the most barbarous and brutal epic ever known, it is essential that all people give their lives to God." Is that what it says? No. That all people of good faith redouble their efforts for peace, justice, and human rights. And they're referring to the UN instruments. They are not referring to the Bible. This is what they're saying on our behalf. At these places, the hierarchy and their representatives are going to these places and saying, we must be a part of the UN and we need to knit ourselves closer together. Okay, so now this is the fourth statement to remove liberty of conscience for Sunday laws. It was made in 1999, all before the year 2000. Do you think there's a reason for that? Because the year 2000 was supposed to usher in the millennium of peace, according to the UN. All in place before that. Throughout history, religious minorities have often been subject to discrimination and outright persecution. Today, religious intolerance and prejudice are again on the rise, and they continue going on. And then they say, we basically uphold the International Bill of Rights. This is a UN document. Well, it's actually a series of documents, which I'll show you in a minute. And once again, they talk about the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And it says this: in support of Article 18 of the United Nations Universal Declaration of Human Rights and other international instruments, doesn't even define what they are, and in harmony with its beliefs and its history. Now, we had an issue with the immunization statement because it went, our health emphasis is based on biblical revelation, the inspired writings of Ellen White, and on peer-reviewed science. And we kept saying that and puts all three of those things on par. But notice here, it doesn't even mention the Bible. It doesn't mention Ellen White, and it mentions our beliefs, whatever those beliefs are, last. So the very first thing when it comes to religious minorities and religious freedom is the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and other international instruments, and in harmony with beliefs and its history. What even is that history that they're referring to? Because there's a history in Germany that wasn't so crash hot. If you listen to one of Conrad Weine's sermon, he goes through all of the terrible things that were done in religious liberty in regards to what happened in Germany. But they say that to defend and protect religious freedom for everyone everywhere, it actually explains in the very next sentence, to that end, we will continue to cooperate with the United Nations. Like that's how they see it. That's how they see actually ensuring that religious liberty will be there. And other international agencies and religious organizations, and to encourage every nation to implement the fundamental rights of religious freedom. And so here we have all of these instruments. The UN ones get mentioned first, and there's no subservience to the Bible or to Ellen White. Now, they mentioned the International Bill of Human Rights. What is that? This is the International Bill of Human Rights. It says the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and the International Covenant on Economic, Social and Cultural Rights, and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. It says together, these three documents make up the International Bill of Human Rights. So let's just have a look. We've looked at the Universal Declaration of Human Rights and saw how faulty that is. Let's look at the other two documents. So this is the one on economic and social and cultural rights. Article 12, the state parties to the present covenant recognize the right of everyone to the enjoyment of the highest attainable standard of physical and mental health. That would include a weekly rest, because that's what they say is a reasonable work. This is decent work. And to the prevention, treatment and control of epidemic, endemic, occupational and other diseases. So we've got to have weekly rest, otherwise we'll have mental health issues. That's going to ensure everyone is, taken care of. And then, of course, I don't know whether you saw some of the articles that were coming out from certain media sources were actually suggesting that COVID was a result of, Gaia or the Mother Earth being offended. And so we need to make sure that we have our communal rest. So this is the other part of that overall body of three documents. And it says in Article 18, very much the same as the Declaration on the Elimination of all forms of discrimination based on religion or belief, which we looked at earlier. It says in number 3, freedom to manifest one's religions or beliefs may be subject only to such limitations as are prescribed by law and are necessary to protect public safety, order, health, or morals, or the fundamental rights and freedoms of others. So in all 4 of those statements, it basically says the law of the land and communal needs are more important than true religious liberty. Once again, this is going back to the council that the General Conference is part of. And this is actually their quadrennial report from 1999. It's interesting their quadrennial reports become less and less informative as the years go by. But in 1999, this is what they said. Our organization cooperates with other NGOs. To build better understanding, we have official dialogues with the World Lutheran Federation, the Patriarch of Constantinople, and the World Reformed Alliance. The church is a member of the World Christian Commission and an advisor to the World Council of Churches. ADRA works with UNDP, the UNHCR, and it lists like a whole bunch of things. We are united to see the UN goals come through. Then it goes on to say, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, the International Covenant of blah, 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 it mentions all these instruments. The church has strong programs in education, health, and religious freedom in harmony with the United Nations recommendations. And they specifically say, look, we even made a statement about the 1995 United Nations Year of Tolerance. Look, we're being good. We're doing everything that we need to. And even one of our church representatives was listed as a speaker for the implementation of the Declaration of Elimination of all forms of intolerance and discrimination based on religion or belief. That document was the one that says that our religious liberty is subject to the laws of the land. We had a speaker there talking about this. Isn't that lovely? One of our church representatives signed a joint statement on the independence of special reporters. So they're actually, having joint statements that they're putting out. The General Conference of the Seventh-day Adventists supports and promotes the United Nations mission in favor of justice, peace, and liberty in more than 200 countries. We've got examples of where religious liberty has been denied in relation to Sabbath observance. In fact, the ANN, in 50 years later after the fact, have an article where the leaders apologized. And I'm not going to go into it a great deal because Conrad Vine's done a sermon on this. This is actually a book, some Dr. Plantack, I'm not really sure how to say his name, but he wrote called The Silent Church, and he talks about how the conference president of the East German conference actually said, under no circumstance did any Adventist have the right to resist the government, even if the government prevented him from exercising his faith. So this is not new, but from a global perspective, it will be new. So how do we get out of this mess? I know people ask me this all the time. At the last general conference, there was a call to have a steering committee to look at these statements and potentially deal with them. Well, the people that are involved in that, or were involved in that steering committee, were aware of the issues because they were specifically communicated with around the immunization statement, and they did nothing. They have received a lot of this information already. I know that because I have been personally involved to a degree. I won't go into too much details. And they're predominantly pastors, and so they should know their Bibles. I'm a lay person. Yes, I have studied my Bible for many years, but I'm a lay person. They're pastors. They should figure it out. Like, it's not rocket science. And the steering committee has actually been completed. Has anything changed? Have the statements moved from under beliefs? Nothing. Nothing has changed. I think we need to realize that there are certain segments of the church who will not turn around, but I'm appealing to those who will. Because Ellen White says that the church is going to go through. We don't know what it's going to look like. We've got to remember, we don't know what it's going to look like. Do not, 100% do not expect it to look like it does now. Because if you look at the book of Jeremiah, it actually indicates that all of the things that we glory in are going to be stripped away. So you need to actually realize that it's going to look really messy, and it's probably not going to be very comfortable, but it's certainly, it's going to be a very trying time. They are supposed to be reporting back to either the Spring Council or to the Annual Council or the Spring Council next year. But I'm preempting this. And I hope I'm really wrong. I hope that they prove me wrong, that they will come back with a report and say, this is what I expect. They'll come back with a report and say, we were perfectly justified in writing these statements because we've always done it. I'm able to do this because I can do it and I've done it. That's not a justification for doing it. That's ridiculous. We've got to actually get rid of these statements. They need to go. We can only have the Bible. That is our fundamental thing. When you don't even actually make these statements subservient in any way to the Bible in the statements themselves, then you have employers going on there and saying, well, there's no reason for you to actually have religious liberty. Now, some people may be aware that the Seventh-day Adventist Church in Canada has actually had its, so it was actually an NGO of the UN as well, and it's had its NGO status suspended, not removed, but just suspended. And the reason why is because they've not submitted quadrennial reports, but the likelihood is if they were to submit another report, they would probably have it all activated again. Now, some others may be aware that the Jehovah's Witnesses were also part of the UN at one point, and there's some lessons that we can take from them. So this is where you can find, I had to actually go back into Internet Archive to find the letter, but there's a letter on the UN website, and I'll just make it a bit bigger, the bit that's important, from the UN, and they must have been getting lots and lots of inquiries, probably from Jehovah's Witnesses, and it says, recently the NGO section has been receiving numerous inquiries regarding the association of the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society, which is the other name for the Jehovah's Witnesses, of New York with the Department of Public Information. Now, I've underlined that because we are not associated with the Department of Public Information. We are in special consultative status with ECOSOC, and ADRA is in general consultative status with ECOSOC. That is a much higher level of connection with the UN than just being associated with the DPI. So the DPI is an entity of the UN that is all about promulgating the ideology of the UN. So they were basically saying, we will be a mouthpiece for the UN. It says in October 2001, the main representative of the Jehovah's Witnesses contacted them and they asked to be no longer associated. And it's actually interesting because it says, and the DPI made a decision to disassociate. So we have to rely on the DPI to go, yes, I don't want to be associated with you in relation to the Jehovah's Witnesses. These were articles that came out at that time. This is what precipitated it. So in The Guardian, on the 9th of October 2001, it came out saying this: the United Nations is being asked to investigate why it has granted associate status to the Jehovah's Witness, the fundamentalist US-based Christian sect which regards it as a scarlet beast predicted in the book of Revelation. It says disaffected members have accused the Witness elderly governing body of hypocrisy in secretly accepting links with an organization that they continue to denounce. The UN itself admitted yesterday that it was surprised that the sect was part of the DPI. And then it says, by no stretch of the imagination could the Watchtower Bible and Tract Society be considered to share the ideals of the UN Charter unless you suppose that destruction of the UN by God is consistent with that charter. Now, they actually believe in an apocalyptic end to this world. Do we? Because if we do as well, then we should not have anything to do with the UN. Being recognized, NGO with United Nations grants status, though not grants, so as a church. And then it said, to qualify, organizations must show that they share the ideals of the Charter, demonstrate interest in UN issues, and have the commitment and means to conduct effective information programs about UN activities. So if the world knows this about the Jehovah's Witnesses back in 2001, and they know that we're associated with the UN, then they assume this about us. Now, in a week later, Monday the 15th of October 2001, it says the Jehovah's Witnesses have hurriedly disaffiliated from the United Nations within days of the Guardian story, which is the one I just showed before, in which members accused the sect of hypocrisy for supporting an organization it has repeatedly denounced privately. And they preempted a UN inquiry. So there was a whole UN inquiry that was going to be had over this whole thing. And they'd be secretly affiliated for 10 years. And then it says, recognize that the organizations are supposed to demonstrate that they share the UN's objectives, and they realized that they did not. And so that's why there was this, big hoo-ha. The key thing is that it was around the whole idea that the UN is going to be destroyed. That was the key point that they actually made, was the UN and the world is going to be destroyed. And so do we believe the UN is going to be destroyed? Yes, we do. Do we believe that the world is going to be destroyed? Yes, we do. Do we believe that the world is going to end? Yes, we do. So clearly we have a very clear biblical mandate to not be caught up with anything that believes otherwise. And so from a world's perspective, we should really disassociate from it. And, the world, if they knew what we believe, they would actually call for us to be disassociated. It's interesting because the Jehovah's Witness leadership had a similar response to what our leadership is having, which is to play down or deny the evidence on the UN website. It's just a conspiracy theory by minority groups. There's nothing to see here. And they were accused of apostasy, which is exactly what has happened to me, because, these things are being said. Now, do we believe this? Seeing then that all these things shall be dissolved, what manner of persons ought you to be in all holy conversation and godliness, looking for and hasting unto the coming of the day of God, wherein the heavens being on fire shall be dissolved, and the elements shall melt with fervent heat. Do we believe that? If Jesus said, I can of my own self do nothing, then we need to acknowledge we can do nothing without him, not nothing without the United Nations. If Paul said, for I know that in me, that is in my flesh, dwelleth no good thing, for to will is present with me, but how to perform that which is good I find not. We need to recognize that humanity does not have the answer to this world's problems, including the UN. If Jesus said, "Think not that I'm come to send peace on the earth, I've come not to send peace, but a sword," then we need to stop pursuing peace in this world. If our church laity cried loud enough and rejected all of the unions, not just with United Nations, but even with the ecumenical organizations, the world would want to decouple with us. Just like the UN wanted to decouple with the JWs when everyone started going, hang on, they don't believe what the UN believes. They shouldn't be associated. This is urgent. This is urgent, urgent, urgent. Please stand up in your churches and declare loud and clear that we can no longer be associated with these things. Remember Achan. We started there. I'm going to go back to there. Ellen White says, to reduce Jericho was seen by Joshua to be the first step in the conquest of Canaan. But Achan did not conquer Jericho. He actually kept Jericho in his heart because he wanted the stuff. And as a consequence, all Israel suffered. In the story of the Good Samaritan, the man who journeyed to Jericho lost everything. If we think that this world is all that we want, we will lose everything. But thankfully, there is a good turn to this story of the Good Samaritan. He gained a redeemer. I've quoted this part earlier. For thus says the Lord, you've sold yourselves for naught, and you shall be redeemed without money. We need to sanctify, set ourselves apart from this world, and cling only to Christ. This is a warning to all of us as I was reading through these statements and realizing the importance of them and just how dire this situation is. I started trembling inside, going, Lord, what have we done? But if we allow the Lord to work, we will say, Lord, what have you done? We need to recognize that God can actually do something if we renounce the ways of the world. Christ and his righteousness, that is all we need. I mean, when you look at righteousness, what is righteousness? It is right doing. It is being in a right relationship with God, not doing according to the UN or being in the right relationship with the UN and the world. We need to lay these garments aside. We need to lay the association aside. I'm pleading. I have suffered. My family has suffered for this ministry. And you may suffer. You may suffer to stand for Christ, but is Christ enough for you? Is his word enough for you? This is the last hour of this earth's history. I know that it is because I can see it's all there. It's all set to go. And the Bible knows, the Bible foretold these things. If you look through the Old Testament prophets, you can see we are tracing the steps of ancient Israel. Please, my brethren, please, please stand and say these things should not have a part in God's church.